Hi, this is Frank Schaefer. I grew up in an evangelical home and I fled that faith, as I've mentioned elsewhere, for instance, in my memoir, Crazy for God. But one thing I took away from my mother's knee, as it were, is that in acts of kindness by people, whether they be strangers or friends or family, acts of mercy, you can see in those acts the person of Christ. Now, I am an atheist. I do not believe Jesus was the Son of God. I think it is doubtful that there is a God, but I do believe that often within Christianity, we see an example of what we wish every human being was like in terms of interactions with us. And I recently had an experience that really, oh, made me feel like I was having a talk with my mom again as a child in terms of what, quote, Christ-like behavior is like. If you see a thing on my head here, it's a silicone patch covering some scarring from a melanoma I had taken off a few weeks ago in Boston at Massioner, which is part of the medical complex of enormous size down there and impersonal and huge and like a factory of medicine. It's been absorbed, Massioner, into the Massachusetts General Hospital. And you would expect that they would churn people through. Um, and I'm someone who had polio when I was uh, 2 years old. My first operation on my left leg was when I was 5. I remember distinctly wearing the hip cast for an entire summer and how some blood from the surgery soaked through into my heel in Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, where my parents took me as the guests of Dr. Kieswater, who was surgeon in chief of that hospital at that time. And at that stage, this was the most forward-thinking of children's hospitals, and later Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was a good friend of mine and became Surgeon General of the United States, was the Surgeon in Chief at Philadelphia Children's Hospital. And then, of course, here in the area I live in, north of Boston, we have Boston Children's Hospital. And I still remember the kindness of the nurses and the doctors and how Dr. Ferguson, who was my surgeon, who had gone to Dartmouth University and was also a skier, he and I talked about skiing together, and he told me that he was glad that I was already a skier and that he hoped this operation of a tendon transplant, I guess, or something where they moved it around to give me more mobility in my left foot would help me in my skiing. And I can remember his kindness. Fast forward, I'm 72 years old now, and I had an anterior discectomy years ago with Dr. Griffith Harsh, a very kind man who taught neuroscience at Harvard, and I was so lucky to get him. And it was a 5-hour operation fixing a broken disc in my spine. He went through, did wonderful procedure. I've had 2 hernia operations. I've had a knee repaired. I know about surgery. And you would think by this time I'd be used to it. But you know, when I went down for this, it was a scary procedure because it was in 2 steps. First, they cut out the melanoma. Then they sent me home with a bandage, told me to sit up all night so it wouldn't bleed. And then the day after the surgery brought me for a second procedure, and somehow having it divided into 2 because they wanted to freeze this and section it and make sure they had gotten all the margins, quite complicated. And then a plastic surgeon who had done the original procedure would then rebuild my forehead a little bit and make a, sort of an H cut here and then pull everything together, and there'd be some tightness and numbness. It's still a little numb. And I had it all explained to me. But what really broke through was that I was dealing with medical personnel that I'd never met in my life, and I was no one special to them. And first of all, Dr. Emrich, who's a plastic surgeon at Mass Eye and Ear, when he sat down with me and explained my surgery to me, it was as if I was the only patient he was going to see that day. Time did not seem to be a factor. I noticed a little scar on his neck, and I asked him what had happened there. He got kicked in the throat while playing soccer in high school, and they had to do a tracheotomy to save his life. And we joked about, what happened to the guy that kicked you, and was he even sent off? And I showed him my scar from the anterior discectomy, and he explained everything. And his physician assistant was so kind, and the nurses in his office were so kind. And I began to realize that, the old French saying of the fish rots from the head down. Well, of course, kindness comes from the head down too. And it was clear to me after dealing with him several times that he had set a tone that had permeated his entire office, from the receptionist to the nurses to the physician assistants. Everyone had a certain way of treating people. And it wasn't just me. I saw them interacting with other patients in the waiting room. I saw their cheerfulness and their kindness. And it wasn't fake. It made me leave his office feeling like I had been in a church service as a child, maybe at Easter, singing rejoiceful hymns about the resurrection of Jesus that I no longer believe in. But it was a spiritual experience, not a medical experience. And I know that sounds a little bit touchy-feely crazy, but it really was. Come what may, I left not only trusting the medical care I was going to get at one of the most wonderful medical places in the world, which is Massioner, such a lucky person to be on Medicare with a little supplemental insurance and able to do that, and such a lucky person to be near there. And I feel so privileged. But I also felt cared for in my spirit, that we were all on one team here and someone had my back. And that experience was exemplified during the first surgery. It scared me because I knew that wasn't the end. I knew when I woke up, I'd have a big pressure bandage and have to be sent home in great discomfort. And I did. You see the pouches under my eyes. Well, there were huge, big blood sacs from the draining of the surgery. No problem. I sent a picture to Dr. Emrich, and he said, no, that's normal. It'll all go away. And it is. You can still see a little puffiness here, but they were terrible looking. And so I went into that first procedure. My son, Francis, came with me and was standing next to me. They let whole families in the pre-op procedure. And as surgeries go, this is not a big deal. It's not open heart surgery, not even as big a deal as my wife a couple of years ago that had a heart attack and had a stent put in by other beautiful people in another hospital in Beverly, Massachusetts, that saved her life. So my procedure wasn't a big deal, but I was worried and frightened. It didn't seem like the other surgeries cut into two parts. So I was apprehensive. And when I was being prepped for surgery, in that pre-op situation, nurses came in, the doctor came in again. Dr. Emrich was so kind. And then my anesthesiologist came in, a lovely woman by the name of Nadia Mogul, and I had never met her before. And my son was sitting here next to me, and she sat down next to me, and again, as if she had all the time in the world, talked through my fears. I said, well, hey, last time I had a colonoscopy, they kind of snowed me, which is the term for maybe too much anesthesia when they're just supposed to sedate you a little. I hope I can wake up quicker from this procedure. And she assured me, she says, oh, I'm not going to do that. You'll be fine. I'll be with you the whole way. But she saw I was anxious. And then she did something that I will never forget the rest of my life. Doesn't seem like a big deal. And remember, I'm 72. I'm a man. I'm supposed to be able to, be strong. But I was worried. And she was sitting here, and I was lying there, and she sat next to me, and Dr. Mogul reached out and took my hand and said, listen, let me tell you something. Everyone in the operating room will have a job, your surgeon and the resident who's going to be helping him. And I'd give him permission to have him be able to teach the resident and the nurses and everybody else. But I only have one job. And she reached out and took my hand. And my job is just to look after you. And all I will be doing is watching over you and making sure that you're fine the whole time, that you're not feeling pain, that you will wake up well when you wake up, that your blood pressure and your heart rate and the amount of oxygen you're absorbing, all I'm doing, my job is just to watch over you. And it was a strange experience because everything I've learned in caring for my 5 grandchildren, everything that I've learned about marriage in 55 years with my beautiful wife, Jeannie, everything I've learned in terms of human wisdom and folly and stupidity, everything I've learned about kindness was represented in that conversation with a woman who is an immigrant from Pakistan and who has come to our shores as a physician and an anesthesiologist. And she teaches anesthesiology at Harvard as well as being an anesthesiologist in the Massioner complex. And for her, it was just another day of work. But her tone was so kind and so tender and so personal. And the fact that she reached out and took my hand, and I'm a 72-year-old man, and the hand already had that cool IV drip going into it, making my skin a little cold. And after she saw that I had relaxed, and boy, if you had been watching my vital signs on a monitor, I bet my blood pressure dropped, I bet my heart rate dropped, I bet everything. I felt such inner peace. Then she looked up at her assistant and she nodded, and the assistant put in the first little injection into the IV line of sedative. But she wanted to make sure I was awake when we had that conversation. And maybe she says that to every patient. But I know one thing for sure, when she does, a sense of being cared for suddenly obliterates the machinery of modern medicine. And in the same way that certain priests and certain pastors and certain social workers, their patients and the people in their congregation say, oh, well, he's a real priest. Or, no, she's the real thing. She's a real teacher. Like my son Francis, who teaches high school as a vocation. He's a real teacher. And he's the one that takes the extra time to tutor people. He's the one that parents come up to me with tears in their eyes. Because his attitude towards teaching is the same as the attitude of my anesthesiologist for that procedure. And that is, I'm here for you. And if there's anything that I've learned in my life about caring for people, it's allowing my children and my grandchildren to know that whatever my failings are, I am here for you. I only have one job. It's you. That's why I'm sitting here. That's what the word grandfather means. It means that I find out that my granddaughter, when her dad takes his next business trip and I cook for them in the evenings and bring the food up to their house that's nearby, it's one of the great pleasures of my life because they give me menu items they want, chicken, rice, and gravy. Do you want it mixed together or do you want it served to you the way I did when you were little? And my teenage grandchildren all say, oh, no, do it the way when we were little, because it hooks up a line of continuity and care in their lives that makes them feel what I felt when Nalia, this lovely physician, took my hand and said, everyone in the OR will be busy doing their jobs, but I only have one job. And I'll be sitting next to you the whole time, and it's to take care of you. And the peace that passeth understanding that filled my heart at that moment, whether Nalia is a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist like me, whether she comes from Pakistan or Tajikistan or Africa or the West Coast or was white or brown, there was no identity politics there. And there was no gender there. They were just human beings. One was a little bit lonely, a little bit frightened, a little bit scared. As old age closes in and my own death approaches nearer every day, as I've already gone through the trauma of a wife who had a heart attack, I'm watching her come back and be saved, and knowing that every day I get up and hug her close, we're getting older and closer to a time when one of us won't be there. And so all these little medical things add up because you know basically it's patchwork and you're not going to stay around for long. And then a hand reaches out and suddenly it's not an anesthesiologist. It's the Good Samaritan from another place and another time, touching the man who has been robbed and beaten and left at the side of the road, and sang, "My only job is to watch over you. My name is Frank Shaver."